is burning down, if you were unaware.
Kind of burning down, so it's very symbolic of 2020. Just like the hurricanes down south, it's like this is just what 2020 is. We're getting so much shit out of the way right now.
Totally.
But then Will's just living in his little bubble with his baseball cap, like he's good.
Will, where are you, dude? I actually don't know where you're based either.
I live just across the Golden Gate Bridge in Mill Valley. So
Wow. Okay.
Go across the bridge and you can go right to the bay or left to the base of the little mountain. I've been trying to hide, and it's pretty pleasant until the heat spikes and you can't leave the house. But we're starting to see blue skies.
How's the smoke been for you?
Bad.
Oof,
Very bad.
Yeah, I've heard. Yeah, I've heard from a couple of my friends. Well, let's give it a couple more minutes, right, Jules? Maybe, 2
Well,
minutes.
we can always just start, and then people can keep rolling on in, right? I don't have to like admit them or anything. They just kind of roll.
Yeah, I'm just gonna hop off and let you run the show. Julie's the expert here, so I'm gonna let her moderate it and kind of take over the reins. But yeah, just to preface, super excited. This is something that we're really excited to start doing a little bit more of. We are lucky. Julie and I are lucky enough to know like super smart people like Frank, Jill, and Will. So we have a lot of questions, and thought it would be best to kind of get everyone together and talk about it together. So all right, with that being said, I'm gonna hand over everything to Julie, and all right, see you later, guys.
Awesome. So like many things, Twitter was the inspiration for this. I've talked to Frank about inflation a bit ever since probably like April or May when we caught up. And then Jill tweeted about it, and Frank was like very quick to chime in and be like, I have a few thoughts on this. So I was like, let's do a jam session here to like just get it all out there, since Twitter is just like mini bites. This way we can have like 45 minutes talking about it. So
and to be fair, I just like inserting myself between Frank and Jill and seeing how much chaos I can cause. So I'm just tagging along for the ride.
That makes it exciting on here. This is perfect. So let's start. Frank, I want to ask you, have you always, I hadn't ever talked to you about inflation before we had this recent convo, which was obviously the government stimulus is crazy, the Fed's printing money, blah, blah, blah. But like inflation's not something that like is a new discussion. We obviously had a lot of people talking about it during the financial crisis too. So have you been concerned about it for a while and it's just never come up in our combos, or is this a new thing?
It's been around. I mean, inflation is a real thing. It's something that a lot of people don't pay attention to. You can feel its effects over decades. You can't feel its effects over, a year at a time. And I think that's why it's not a topic of conversation. So many of the businesses that we invest in, they're worried about what they're going to do tomorrow. And they're worried about, getting traction now and what they can build in the next year or two. But the effects of inflation are pretty pronounced over time. And I think 2020, with all of its problems, things are coming to a head, when it comes to minimum wage, when it comes to printing money, when it comes to housing issues. But I think it's just everything is centering on this one issue that is a big theme that people need to learn more about.
Right. Will and Jill, what about, I'll go to Jill first, and she's the one that posed this question on Twitter. Have you been worried about this for a while? Does it play any role in why you think Bitcoin is, or you're big into crypto, or is that just not related at all?
Yeah, no, totally. For context, I started my career with a brief stint on Wall Street, where I was working in Latin American debt markets. And if you know anything about Latin America, many of the countries there are no stranger to inflation. And so this was sort of 2012, 13, 14. I was trading countries like Argentina and Venezuela, their sovereign debt. And obviously there were very extreme inflation dynamics in both of those places. And it was through that lens, actually through the lens of inflation and also capital controls and various other financial policy restrictions that these types of countries were dealing with, that I first got interested in Bitcoin. And to me, Bitcoin's primary value prop has always been about two things. One is censorship resistance. So basically the ability to do things with your money and finances that the powers that be don't want you to do, which we can have a debate about whether that's good or bad or ugly. I won't bring that up right now. But the other thing is it's a scarce asset. It's provably scarce. Much like people draw comparisons to gold, and therefore is a pretty clear case to be made that it could act as an inflation hedge. And so inflation is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, examining, both from the very like real practical perspective of countries that are and have dealt with inflation, but also from the perspective of like what has been going on in the United States and other developed markets over the last decade plus in terms of monetary policy decisions, in terms of fiscal stimulus, and so forth, and just looking at those dynamics and saying, oh, okay, the bill is going to come due at some point. You know, how long can we keep a system on life support before, as I say, the bill comes due, and that bill may come due in the form of inflation. So that's kind of where I'm coming at it from and my perspective on it. And to answer your question, Julie, yes, I spend a lot of time, probably too much time as an early stage venture capital investor, thinking about macro dynamics like inflation.
Will, what made you so quick to jump in on this? Did you just want to hear Frank and Jill's thoughts, or like, is this something you think about too?
Like I said, I look for I like poking Jill and I like poking Frank. So the opportunity to do both in a public setting was too good not to jump in the middle of. No, I'm going to try to tie this into fintech venture investing, which is, I know the three of us on the call have spent a lot of time thinking about how do you actually use software to change economic outcomes for average Americans, right? And so we've kind of been around that bend a lot of time. And I think where inflation gets interesting is, and I'm going to go over my skis, but inflation, when it's forecasted and knowable, and importantly shared evenly across society or even close to evenly, isn't that big a deal, and it can be managed. And actually, it's part of a healthy economic cycle. I think what's interesting to me here is you've got an increasingly disparate impact in terms of liquidity, finance, anything you want to say in the U.S., where what's happening from the current printing at a lot of the central banks is it's not flowing into the economy in any sort of flat fashion, right? It's got a fat head of the tail that it's going to, just like wealth inequality, right? Just like where wealth has been building. And I think when you look at, hey, our goal is to use software to change outcomes for the average American, inflation plays a role because you're kind of swimming uphill. I've had this sideline concern about measuring GDP for a long time, that in an IP heavy economy, it's really hard to account for GDP because you're playing high margin. And I always say that you take revenue, you cut it in half with innovation, and you give it to 1/100th or 1/1000th the amount of people that the wealth that accrues. The same thing is now happening with money, which is kind of fascinating, right? That because of where the stimulus and the printing is going and what has happened because of intellectual property wealth creation, it's not going into society as a whole. And then you have the added layer of, it's not just us doing it. So like, that's the scary relative or kind of the US centric approach. And the other part that's intellectually very interesting to me is then, okay, but what happens since inflation is a relative game when everybody's printing? So I don't have any good answers, but I do think it applies to a lot of the work we're trying to do from a fintech lens about whether or not you need to take this into account as you think about moving and helping people, or does this fall into a macro global narrative, right? We've never had a global society like this, and if everybody prints, does everyone print? And so you'll learn with me, I never know the answer, but it's a fascinating gray area that I do think affects our work on the ground level as technology investors. How's that?
Yeah. I think a lot of what you said, Will, I mean, it's profound, especially when you watch the compounding effects of it not going to people equally, in society. So, I just pulled a couple statistics, and people know these figures pretty well. But if you actually look at what happened when the Fed was created 107 years ago, so back in 1913, and you fast forward to today, if you just had $1 back then in 1913, and then you fast forwarded today, it would basically be worth about 3.8 cents, right, in terms of its buying power. So, over long periods of time, inflation has taken its toll in the United States. But the same thing can't be said if you had $1 that was invested in the stock market over that same period of time. You would have something like $26,000 today, right? So instead of having 3.8 cents of buying power, you would have $26,000 of buying power. Now, those are giant extremes, and there are a lot of categories of assets that are in the middle. But for people who don't have the ability to save, they're basically working in order to pay their bills, they're working paycheck to paycheck, they're caught in the trap of what is the dollar worth and how much is it deflated every year. And for those people in society that they have the ability to invest in companies or to invest in hard assets like gold, an ounce of gold today, by that same standard, would buy about $94 worth of stuff, right? So, you would accrete value if you had invested in gold. If you look at housing, you would have accreted value over that same period of time. So for people who are able to hold on to tangible assets that have been outpacing inflation and accreting, it has such a profound effect on wealth distribution that you can't not pay attention to inflation, especially what's happening right now with the printing of money, right? I mean, you print money, you have to pay for it. And, I'd love Jill's thoughts on how you pay for it. But one way is tax income, one way is inflation, right? I mean, there are a lot of theories out there that say there are other ways of paying for it. But at least two of the basic ways, we all know what they are, and it's going to affect the working class pretty hard.
Which, to just piggyback on that, inflation is a form of tax. It's not often discussed as such in sort of common parlance outside of, academia and economics, but inflation is a form of tax. And I think it's really worth calling that out. And just, to me, Will, something you mentioned is if inflation can be sort of pervasive and sort of equally distributed across goods and across society, then it doesn't necessarily always sort of create this mass wealth inequality. And while I think that's true in theory, as you were talking, I was trying to come up with an example, and I think you would agree with this, where that's played out in reality. And I can't come up with one, because at the end of the day, it comes down to three things, I think. It's, who in the society has access to investments, in the form of equities or other types of goods like that, assets like that, who has access to debt, and who has access to real estate. And, in the United States, 10% of the population only owns 90% of all household stocks. So this is equities that, are not owned by hedge funds and big asset managers, but are owned directly by households. Only 10% of the population, right? And so, Frank, to go back to your point around equities is one place where you can sort of flee with your capital to evade inflation. That's a huge problem in terms of inequality. In terms of who has access to debt, if you can take out loans and you're in an inflationary environment, great. You can go and take those loans and buy goods up front and have the debt get inflated away over time. And then real estate, probably speaks for itself as one of the great inflation hedges. But there again, we don't need to rehash sort of all of the conversations that have been had around the falsehood of the American dream and who actually owns and has access to real estate in this country. But I think that's exactly right, that inequality is at the heart of this conversation.
Yeah, and when you print enough money, if you assume that it has to be paid back in some form because it's a tax, we might find ourselves in a decade that resembles something like the 1980s or maybe the 1970s. And if we go through a period of inflation like that, people who haven't studied inflation aren't prepared for the eye-popping numbers that come out, compounding over a decade. But I mean, a typical decade, the cost of living goes up by 20 to 25%, over the course of a decade, somewhere around 1.5 to 2.5% inflation. But in the 1970s, the cost of living went up by, close to 90% over the course of the decade, right? I mean, that is not, something that you can just brush under the rug and say, I'm okay holding my money in dollars. At the end of the decade, I'm now basically giving away 50% of it to inflation. And if you look at, the 1980s, cost of living went up by 50%. So you had 2 decades that, in a very short period of time in people's lives, the cost of living went up massively. And, if you were a holder of real estate during that same period, you did just fine. Right? I mean, you outpaced inflation by a significant amount. The average house went up by something like 160% in the 1970s and, close to 100% in the 1980s. So you're outpacing inflation by enough that, you can either tap the equity in your house through debt, or you can sell your house and have the gains, or you could be an SFR investor and end up getting both rental yield and appreciation. And for the people that were, in that camp where they had a house at the beginning of one of those decades, they did just fine. But the people who didn't, it started to create a wealth gap. And I think we're seeing the same thing now. And this decade could be very, very similar, where at the end of the decade, I wouldn't be surprised if things are 60 to 80% more expensive than they were at the beginning of the decade. And if you don't own tangible assets, you're going to find yourself moving backwards.
We have a question from people that are listening. So, and I think this is a good one as well, is like, what do we think the Fed is going to say about the actions it's having to take? Because they obviously have to have inflation targets and stuff as well. So what are they going to use to sort of justify this and talk about how they're going to make sure that we don't see Latin America style inflation in developed nations like the US?
I'll go first here. I don't know how worried the Fed or anyone else really is about this yet. And I think that that's actually a reasonable position for the Fed and for, you know, large asset managers and other large institutional players to take for a few reasons. One is, you know, if anything, over the last few months, what we've seen exacerbated is actually a dollar shortage globally, which comes back to the reality of the world that we live in, which is the US dollar has the privileged position of being the global reserve currency. Now, this again is something that drives me crazy because it's never framed like this. It's never framed as this massively political and sort of diplomatic dynamic whereby the US got this privilege at the end of World War II, so on and so forth. And what it means today is that, you know, every country in the world has to hold US dollars, and therefore we can kind of afford to inflate ourselves out of situations like COVID, at least for some period of time, because we have this basically artificially imposed demand, external demand for US dollars. And so, you know, that's kind of my take, is I don't think in the short term we're going to see much in the way of statements or action addressing this issue until it becomes sort of a real problem. And that's the thing about inflation. It's, you know, gradually, and then suddenly, always.
And this is part of the issue with the lack. This is part of the issue with the lack of the slackening independence of the Fed, right? Show me the incentives, I'll tell you the outcome. The incentives here are not to be prudent 30-year fiscal stewards anymore. That we've really lost that. So what are we going to hear about inflation? We're going to hear about nothing. I mean, we're not going to hear anything meaningful, in my opinion, because that's just not in the current incentive structure of the Fed. But do you know what Jill? Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, I do think we have to overlay the fact that there actually are a lot of deflationary pressures because of productivity. And I think that means that we can actually afford a significant amount of inflation before it hurts. And, you know, the easiest way to deal with, you know, inflation after it kicks in and after people realize it, and to Will's point, they might not, you know, realize it until someone raises their hand and says you have to do something about this. But, you know, there are some pretty big movements in the political parties to create a working wage, which is really about a one-time adjustment for catching up against the effects of inflation over time. And, you know, if we end up moving the minimum wage up to $15, you know, and there are some proposals that should go into effect immediately. Other people are saying we should grade it in by 2024. I mean, it is a massive redistribution of wealth. You know, it is a massive one-time catch-up, you know, to what's happened with inflation over time. It is a tax on businesses and holders of stock, and it's redistributing the wealth, you know, to the bottom tier, you know, of the working American. And I think it's really, really important, because if that happens, that one-time adjustment could make up for a lot of the issues that have been pent up and built up to create a real working wage.
So we have a question that Jill started to answer, and then did not quite finish here from our Q&A too. So this is something I've kind of wondered for a while too, is like, we've talked about inflation becoming this thing in the US for a while, right? Like after the financial crisis, everyone's like, we're printing so much money, blah, 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 there's gonna be bad inflation. Like when I graduated high school in 2009, my graduation present was 1 ounce of gold, because my dad was so convinced that inflation was gonna be this big thing. Thankfully, like gold was like $700 then, so it's become a great graduation gift. But like back then, he got it because he's like, oh my god, like inflation is bad, like you need to own gold, like put like 50% of your assets in it, whatever. And it, like gold's done fine, but like the crazy inflation has never really materialized, right? So are we convinced it's going to happen this time? Are we not convinced? And like, what's going to sway things one way or the other?
Yeah, and Jim Greco was asking this in the chat as well, drawing the parallel to Japan very rightly, where for 30 years people have been talking about, you know, Japan's monetary policy, and all it's really done is pushed up asset prices globally in terms of capital markets and those types of financial assets, without actually budging the deflationary pressures in Japan. And I think that it's super accurate. And as I say, I, in many ways, am not convinced that, certainly I'm not convinced that the Fed or other organizations and entities and even people are going to start worrying about this anytime soon. And I actually don't think that that's wrong, because as Frank was saying as well, there are a lot of deflationary pressures. And that also goes globally. Like, one of the biggest questions I've been asking myself over this period of COVID is just the question of, where is growth going to come from? Like, what is the engine driving that? You know, can we rely on China to be that engine in the same way that we have for the last 2 decades? I don't really know. You know, if you look at the developed world, if you look at the population dynamics, they look a lot like Japan's population dynamics have for the last 30 years. And that also becomes a scary thing from an economic perspective, but perhaps a comforting thing from the perspective of, like, is inflation going to become an issue anytime soon? So.
All right, Frank, Will, you want to weigh in? Either of you guys?
Yeah, I mean, look, we have very uncertain outcomes in the future. What we do know is that the government has been printing money. What we do know is that there's a movement around the working wage in America, and this income inequality, it's probably hit a tipping point at this point, or we have to do something about it as a country. And when you start to put all of these, you know, individual things together, my personal take is that we will start to see inflation. And I could even see scenarios where we get into a minor or major trade war with China and start onshoring certain types of jobs. And if we start onshoring manufacturing jobs, you know, that's going to increase the cost of goods in the United States. But if it's accompanied by a raise in minimum wage, you know, the people who are most likely to be consumers are going to be able to afford the increases. But the natural thing, when labor costs go up, businesses will try to raise prices, you know, to offset at least some of it. And again, if minimum wage goes up, it means that there's at least a way to justify it because people now have more money in their hands. So I actually think there's a lot of pressure there. I also think.
So wait, can I jump in on that, Frank? Does that make you slightly bullish, right? Because so let me play this thought out real time. As Joe knows, this could get ugly fast. I could fall off the cliff. Right, like, one of my big concerns with this is driving. Again, I have this big fear that in a tech-forward, IP-based economy, for the first time, you have negative network effects on wealth creation, which is just to say, Larry and Sergey don't need that many more people to generate massive margin. And so one of the scary things about inflation, right, is as you print money and it follows the same channels, my concern had been that, right, that you end up driving us to a place where capitalism is no longer tenable in the US. And I think what you're saying actually makes me slightly bullish, connecting the dots to driving more manufacturing. Yes, sure, you still, and the full, so I'll take your whole argument, but in the context of the rest of the world continuing to hold us as the reserve currency and printing themselves out of problems, that actually sounds like a pretty ideal end state where you've got more jobs in America, more consumers, right? And our relative purchasing power globally is at least maintained. Like, of all the credible paths in the next 10 years, that to me is like one of the least depressing.
Yeah, I'm not saying that I am raising my hand for a trade war on China, but I think.
But I want to make sure I'm understanding you right. I'm like following your logic, because, like, honestly, that to me, it does not sound like, I don't know if it's gold medal, but it's definitely not like participant ribbon when it comes to outcomes.
Something worth pointing out here, which is that there are historically 2 main buckets that you can kind of categorize inflationary cycles in. One is driven by the increasing costs to production and then therefore increasing costs to consumers. And then, but by virtue of that, you can also increase the wages of the people who are, in those production cycles, et cetera. And this sort of spiral upwards from there. But then there's the other dynamic, which is more of what we're talking about, I think, or at least, more of what I observe happening, which is just like the debasement of the local currency that is more kind of artificially induced or creative, not by virtue of like some, something that's going on sort of more organically within the economy, but by virtue of what the central bank is doing. And Frank, if I'm hearing correctly, I think that part of what you're talking about with like the onshoring manufacturing jobs, the way that I understood that was that could then sort of contribute in more of this sort of organic economic inflationary upward spiral kind of way to a dynamic that's already happening with the debasement of the dollar. Is that fair? Is that?
I think it is fair. I also think that there are a lot of reasons that it would be popular to bring jobs back into the country, right? Whether it's ESG concerns, whether it's human rights issues, whether it's about onshoring our supply chain, after what happened with COVID. So as we start to onshore more, it creates more jobs. If it creates more jobs, then minimum wage goes up. It's really an effective tax on business, which is a tax on shareholders, which is really a redistribution of wealth. And I think, this flywheel, if it's done well, can actually make inflation to a reasonable number. The other thing that I think is important to internalize, there's so many proponents out there that say crypto is great and Fed policy is bad because, they can control what the debasement of the currency is. And we can create a store of value that's not controlled, by inflation or affected by inflation. But, I think the government having the ability to print money has a lot of benefit to it. It means that there are very big, important projects that can get done without actually asking permission. Right? I mean, a lot of people don't internalize what happens when the government is printing money. They're printing money to do something, to spend the money, right? And if you think about, massive situations that we had to work our way out of as a country, things like the Great Depression, things like World War II, where, the government needed to buy things and needed to spend money on things and didn't want to have to, ask citizens to voluntarily contribute, right? It's just a tax that gets paid for later and the government gets to choose what to work on. And I think that we've got some big projects ahead of us, things like clean energy, which should create a lot of jobs, but also is going to require a lot of money and investment. And, the government, I think it's going to put pressure on the government to continue printing money for the next couple of decades. And it's why I think about inflation, quite a bit, and kind of this cycle of inflation kicks in. And if the government continues to print money, how do you redistribute the money to, the people in society that they don't have access to capital to invest or capital to save or capital to.
That's why your vision of the trade war with China gets me slightly bullish. Honestly, on a 100-year timeline, I'm not kidding. I'm like, that seems like the most.
Will, I'm curious for who? Who is it good for?
Well, so listen, for the end state, for the American economy as a whole, to hold up in that,
because we started this conversation talking about the dynamics of inequality as they relate to inflation, and I want to come back there for a second. For the long tail we care about. So as Frank proposes it, right, it becomes a tax on business and a tax on shareholders. The most politically feasible way to do redistribution, where it's held, unfortunately, is amongst equity shareholders, right? Like that is the problem, especially when it comes to cash flow earnings, right? What they own is even smaller percentage than you gave of 10% owning 90% when it comes to percentage of owned cash flows. The most elegant capitalist way to redistribute the wealth is through inflation. And I hadn't put those two dots together. Can I push on that for a second? So
please, because I'm just getting there.
Okay. Did I cut you off? Were you going to say something else?
No. Like
okay.
Push on it, because like I just showed up on this conviction 30 seconds ago.
Here's the thing: is Frank said at the beginning of this call, you know, there's kind of a dichotomy here, as I framed it. When the bill comes due, how do you pay it? You can pay it via tax as we normally conceive of it, or via inflation, which is also a form of tax, but, you know, kind of a very different dynamic. Now, okay, I'm going to get controversial here maybe for a minute.
Yes.
I think a lot of the attendees here are in venture and tech somehow, probably read a lot of Paul Graham. I know you're never supposed to say anything bad about a Paul Graham essay, but he came out earlier this week, or maybe late last week, with an essay about the wealth tax and about how the wealth tax is problematic because it compounds over time, because you are taxing the same amount of wealth, you know, over and over and over again at 0.5% a year, 2% a year, 6% a year. Fine. You know what else compounds over time is inflation. And inflation, unlike taxation, at least as we experience it in the United States, and certainly as a proposed wealth tax would implement it, inflation hurts the have-nots, whereas taxation tends to disproportionately take from the haves. And so, you know, I had kind of many gripes with this essay. Firstly, because it was basically just explaining compounding via the wealth tax, as though this was something that was very specific to the wealth tax. And in fact, compounding is something that we think about all day long and experience all day long in many forms, but also because it was talking about this compounding effect of the wealth tax in this kind of vacuum without comparing it to what we're experiencing today, which, whether or not it's inflation in the sense of, you know, an uptick in CPI that we tend to look for, or it's just inflation in the sense of, okay, we're printing a lot of dollars, and okay, you know, those who are holding on to stocks and real estate and have the ability to take out debt are somewhat immune to it or can even benefit from it. Whereas, you know, those who are just earning their, you know, weekly or hourly wage don't have the ability perhaps to benefit from it in the same way. You know, you just look at those two dynamics, and to me, that's a big conversation here that's not being had. And to bring it back full circle, Will, to your point, I, based on you know, my experience and also what I've observed of other countries that have gone through this, I think inflation tends to dramatically disproportionately hurt the have-nots relative to the other way of paying for all of this, i.e. the tax. So that is my rant. I'll hand over the mic again.
I don't disagree, right? That's the historical paradigm. I don't necessarily think it's tax. Like, listen, I'm in a universal basic income bucket. Like, if you had to throw me in a, how do we survive the next 50 years without massive revolution? Like, I just don't know how we all keep doing our job in Silicon Valley, which continues to eliminate labor while compounding wealth to fewer and fewer people. I don't know how we combat that without slicing the pie differently. And either you can tax and redistribute, which I think is, so yes, tax, but if you can go and redistribute it elegantly and not have it get stuck in the system, or by an implicit tax, which to me is largely politically infeasible over the next 10 years, which is the critical time to do it, versus, again, holding Frank's thought bubble as true, and I'm going to, because Frank is a lot smarter than I am, that doing it via inflation, which is a soft tax and redistribution of wealth, assuming incomes at the long tail of employment, you get more employment in the long tail at higher levels, that does become a soft redistribution tax that is super politically viable. So I get that it has no historical precedent, but you don't also have the level of printing in a reserve currency, right? Like so all those start to come together going, holy shit, that actually might be the threading of 6 needles, right, with one throw that gets us out of it. Just a paradigm I hadn't thought through.
I fixate on minimum wage because I think it is politically viable, and it gets money into the hands of the people that, from both a political and a redistribution standpoint, have been disproportionately affected for a long period of time, right? So again, if we throw out some of the numbers, inflation has taken such a toll on minimum wage, because there hasn't been an increase in minimum wage in a long time, that today's minimum wage in inflation adjusted to dollars is 15% less than it was in 2009 when it was last raised, and about 28% below its peak value in the late 1960s. And if you actually look at productivity adjusted inflation, the minimum wage should be $22.19 today, right? So if we actually redistributed all of the productivity and said the workers are going to get 100% of that benefit, and we're going to adjust for inflation, minimum wage would be $22. Now, where it stands today, all of that delta between where it is today and that $22 has accrued to business. It's accrued to holders of stocks. It's accrued to profits. It's accrued to people who had the ability to actually have capital to invest. And, whenever you have a redistribution, you either have to do it gradually or you have to do it suddenly. And in this case, doing it suddenly makes up for a significant period of inflation that we haven't taken care of. It takes care of a lot of social unrest. It will increase prices and it will drive inflation, but it's going to increase the wages more than inflation. That the effect will be felt more class than the upper middle class than it will, on the bottom tier, the minimum wage workers. So I actually think it's just a politically viable way of addressing this situation. The question is, if inflation kicks in at a large enough pace, you find yourself in the exact same situation again, because we're now in an economy and society where productivity is outpacing just about everything, right? We are a technologically led society. So if technology is always going to outpace, then business is going to benefit, capitalists are going to benefit, and there's going to be pressure on the working class.
So does this impact how you guys invest in fintech at all? And can fintech help with this? Just because anytime we've experienced any bouts of inflation in the past, fintech wasn't really a thing. And obviously we weren't as far along as a society in terms of tech and productivity, like Frank said. Last time we were, more worried about this. So how does that change the dynamic at all?
Yeah, I mean, we've thought about this in the context of individual businesses. So I can tell you there are so many good founders out there that are trying to deal with retirement, but retirement might be an insoluble problem, for whole pieces of society, especially when you start to think about inflation, if something isn't done about it. Because compounding that issue is not just inflation, by the way, if we want to get into a really, ugly topic that's really controversial. People are living longer. Right, so if you're trying to figure out how to retire at the same age and inflation is kicking in and people are living an extra 1.5 to 2 years per decade, we have a pretty big issue. And by the way, people are aging in an unhealthy fashion. That's a really, really difficult problem to solve. But if you're an investor in business models that deal with spend, let's just take the neobanks as an example. They're dealing with the bottom 50% of the United States that, live their daily lives using debit cards. If minimum wage goes up, you're going to have 15 to 20% more spend, going directly through all of these rails. If you look at any of the e-commerce, sites, anything payments related, if more money actually goes through the rails, they're going to make more money. So, I think there's going to be some beneficiaries of inflation, and I think there's some other problems that are just even more difficult to solve than they were before, like retirement.
Jill, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would say that at the heart of it, I'm not gonna BS here and pretend like fintech can fix this underlying structural macroeconomic issue. And I appreciate that. I don't think anyone on this call is going to pretend that. I think that a lot of what is always kind of awe-inspiring to me about fintech companies and founders is that they are working so hard to slap a fresh coat of paint on such a broken system, and oftentimes doing it very well. And what I think there is very cool is that can lead to very real behavior changes. And so for me, a lot of it comes back to getting people who wouldn't otherwise, but who are able to currently, to invest, to diversify. And again, not only to save, to save in dollars, which I still think is the best thing that you can do, but to diversify from those savings and and get that money deployed. And I know Will disagree with me on this, but I think that for all the bad that Robinhood has done, again, from kind of a behavioral perspective here, for all of
weren't even the ones that brought it up.
I know.
I avoided it. They're so good. I'm so proud of myself.
For all of the problematic things that Robinhood has incentivized with gamification, et cetera, and easy access to options trading and so forth, I think that one of the most exciting things to me about my observations of the Robinhood rally, and this is even just anecdotal, people in my life who formerly were not sort of like the demographic that nerds out on Wall Street bets or what have you, getting into the markets for the first time. And again, maybe not in the sort of traditional, like, I'm going to buy an S&P index fund and leave it there. And that's still probably the wisest thing to do. But just seeing it be really genuinely democratized out of the 10% that I alluded to earlier, I think is a powerful dynamic. So
Jill,
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in real quick, Frank. Or do you want to go?
Go right ahead.
Robinhood, yeah.
No, I was just gonna say, I like to put a slightly altruistic spin on it. And I know Frank and Jill agree with this because we all talk about it a lot. Like, software is really, really good at running objective tasks against easily movable objects, i.e. bits, not atoms, right? And so I think while the Titanic is sailing in the direction that we all have no control over. I don't think we're gonna sit here and tell you like we can influence the long tail, like the economic gravity that we're all being pulled into. But I do think there's an opportunity to really finally get software applied to people's financial lives in such a way that if it doesn't create excess liquidity, at a minimum helps them optimize their current liquidity. So I think we've all been very focused on how do you get to that atomic unit of here's what I make, here's when I make it. Here is a very clean look at my earning power, my monthly cash flows, my assets, and my liabilities. Because once you have that fully digital and in a 99.9% clean environment, I do believe that software can start making a dent for folks, right? I don't think it lifts people for whom they don't make it past the monthly basics, right? And I do think there's a compounding effect in the way that wealth was created in the U.S. at this point that like will be have to addressed by taking and giving. But for that bell curve in the middle that's been shifted out, I do think we can continue to push founders to think about how they deliver software in an optimal format to maybe create marginal liquidity for people and then definitely optimize the liquidity they do have. And so we've got some investments in things that are expanding access to 401ks. Frank and I have traded a lot of ideas of how do you get to that core unit so that you can begin to examine it and apply it the right way. And so while I still believe 90% of the fintech ecosystem is slapping new paint on ideas, some which have equity value, some which will never have equity value, I do think there are a handful of people fundamentally working to either use technology to create more liquidity by shaving costs and doing some other things and democratizing access, or finally getting to the place that software can run objectively, the logic can run on top of a digital atomic unit and optimize finance for people.
Does this change your fund timeline at all? That was one question in the chat that I was kind of curious about, or does it not impact it?
Not for us.
Not really. I mean, if I were not a fintech investor, but just an investor, thinking through the issue of inflation, the trade that I'm putting on the books is buying as much entry level and mid-class SFR as possible, so single family real estate, and slapping 30-year money on it, right? I mean, if there's a hedge against inflation that's, safe and sound real estate in 1.0 cities, especially if there's a pressure on minimum wage, it's going to bring up rent levels, and at the same time, you're accreting value in the tangible asset. I mean, it's just such a safe and sound strategy that, I know of people who are actually trying to, roll up billions of dollars of real estate and slap long-term money on it. So, that's aside from being a fintech investor. If I were just an investor, real estate right now would probably be my pick. It's also easier than, some of the other strategies that are out there. There are a lot of vehicles that you can invest in. We have a few companies that are kind of innovating in the space, but real estate would be my first pick. I think stocks are incredibly interesting. I love the democratization of what's happening. And, we're just getting back to the levels of individual investors holding stocks as, happened about 100 years ago. It's taken us almost 100 years to get back to the ownership levels, that we were at peak. So I think it's nice to see individual stock in people's hands. I see in the comments a little plug for the post that I put out today, but you can get a little bit more about my perspective on it, through that lens, because there's a lot of other good that comes from trading stocks as well. There's a lot of other dimensions than just the financial returns. But I'm a big fan of what's happening in the space, even though there are some flaws and some issues. I think it's a good trend.
What about so Jill, what about on the crypto side? Should we all be buying Bitcoin? Does this impact it at all? Or, what are your thoughts on that?
I was just gonna say,
Jill's gonna talk her book. Book talking coming.
No, I'm very balanced on Bitcoin. Probably
I'm just kidding.
So I probably should talk my book more. But I think that the biggest thing here, I'm not going to say to buy Bitcoin or not right now, but I think the thing is to not discount crypto. I think that especially amongst like VCs and maybe even the general population, like there was a lot of tourism into Bitcoin and crypto in sort of 2017 when it ran up to 20,000 and everyone suddenly overnight became convinced it was going to be the next great thing. Of course, then it dropped over the following 18 months to about 3,000. A lot of people got taken out in the wash, and a lot of people just kind of walked away, I think, and forgot it. And I would encourage people, as you're thinking about the macro environment, again, whether it ends up being inflationary or not, I think that Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are going to have a major role to play here, whether that's from the perspective, again, of these sort of like very sort of macroeconomic and sort of monetary policy driven dynamics, or whether that's just from the perspective of like very different behaviors amongst younger millennials and Gen Z as it comes to dealing with finances, thinking about investing, thinking about what a reasonable allocation of capital into different areas is. And so I would say, yeah, now is the time to be revisiting it if you sniffed around in 2017 and then walked away disappointed.
What about you guys? So over the last, I guess even before this, but in particular recently, has there been anything that you've looked at that you invested in because of your thoughts on inflation or no? Like Frank brought up some interesting points, how like if you're a payments company and all of a sudden like people are spending more money through these debit cards, then you're making more money that way, and the neobanks and stuff too. So I don't know if that's actually been one of the driving sources of your decision lately.
Yeah, I could say almost the opposite, which is I am a little bit depressed that we haven't found good solutions for retirement, because I do think that we have a systemic problem in the United States, and I don't know how you solve it. And, throwing technology at it isn't necessarily the answer. There's a compounding effect of just not having enough money to set aside for retirement. And with people living longer, it's just harder. So I think it's made us shy away, from some investments where some wide-eyed founders are trying to help people in their 30s, plan for retirement. And I just don't know how you make that business work. But I am very keen on businesses that are enabling the bottom 50%, of the working class in the United States, because I think there's going to be upward pressure on wages, which I think means a lot for how the money flows through the system.
I was just going to say, I don't think VCs are that smart to account. We're not that smart. So accounting for all of this, I think is a bridge too far. I do think one thing that comes up as we talk about businesses, and it's sad to say, is like people just don't have that much money. I mean, I know Julie knows from our circles on Robinhood. I think there's a lot of very amazing and bullish things happening with the company, but the liquidity profile and future prospects of their average customer are dramatically different than the 65-year-old Schwab account, right? So I think on an comp analysis, there's just a problem of the money is concentrated in the hands of too few people.
Yeah. What about, so we talked about democratizing access to stocks. What about democratizing access to other things like real estate, like Frank has been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we have some in the space, and I'm not going to hawk our companies on this panel, but you can look them up and find them on your own. But I think democratizing real estate is a real thing, and you can buy public vehicles like REIT. If you're really interested, I have SPAC on the mind, like everyone else. But you can buy REITs, and I think there are public stocks that you can invest in as well. Like Lennar is a really interesting housing manufacturing company. They're a builder, and they build kind of the cookie cutter housing that, people are going to be wanting and buying. So there are a lot of ways of playing real estate, not just through fintech and investing in, fractional shares of houses. And there's a lot of ways of playing.
This is where Frank and I differ slightly. Like, I understand his thesis, but I think that is deck chairs on the Titanic a little bit, right? Like, I think it still just doesn't get to the fundamental issue of most people don't know, can they afford to diversify into real estate? How could they get more cash flow out? What could they be doing differently to their monthly P&L? And so I'm a little bit on a windmill tinting hunt or tilting at windmills, just trying to understand, can we get to that place where you can with software understand someone's earning power? Because I think everything Frank is saying after that point makes total sense. I just think the fundamental issues, the people for whom you might be able to squeeze a little bit of liquidity out of it, them understanding, should I refi my student debt versus diversify? I'm not sure the average consumer should be making that choice. And I do think software can play a powerful role in helping people optimize, but you need to get to this core atomic unit that we've struggled to get to forever and ever.
This is like a bigger question probably, but why hasn't there been a fintech company that does a better job at that yet? Like, I don't really think there's that many out there that do that great of a job at telling people what the hell to do.
Because Frank, you want to do it or me? We're going to say the same thing. Truth file. The answer is there's no unified truth file, and because we're in this crossover period of financial lives, right? With a lot of legacy, you got a B of A account that has to talk to. We just haven't come up with a standard to come up with the truth file so that I can understand what are your assets, what are your liabilities, what is your monthly, daily, what is your discretionary, non-discretionary P&L look like?
What are your goals?
And then being able to synthesize all of that in a cleansed digital format. I mean, one of the things I always joke about of why is this hard? Starbucks shows up like 17 different ways on a bank ledger. How can you begin to know what was actually food versus not food, right? And until you get to that level of granularity and the ability to quickly at one click bring in my wife's student loan, the software layer is the easy part. The application layer is the easy part if you can get the truth file cleansed, right?
I'm going to back it up here because I don't actually fully agree with this. I think that the problem is actually much more fundamental. It's not a product problem. It's not like a data cleansing problem. It's not an infrastructure problem. The problem is behavioral. People hate thinking about their finances. People hate being told to be more responsible with their finances. It's a source of fear for a lot of people, regardless of how much wealth you have. And I think that until we can crack from a product perspective, perhaps, but there are lots of ways to sort of approach this also from like a more cultural perspective, societal, you name it, how to change that relationship with money and our financial lives and our behaviors. And this is, again, where I think that Robinhood and, a lot of the sort of Robinhood follow-on companies that are now emerging out of it are starting to crack that. Yes, it has to do with gamification. Yes, it has to do with basically recasting investing as gambling, all of which is scary in its own ways, but all of which I think is better than having people go out and play the lottery, which is federally funded and state funded. Like, why aren't we talking about that if this is what we're worried about? Why? Yeah.
Joe, I don't think we disagree on the behavioral aspects. My theory is I actually believe you need to get the people's decisions out of the way, right? And I think the money, once it's in a cleansed data file, I think you can start routing things almost in recipe fashion that are in people's best. What they don't want to do is actually pull out their statement, understand where they were screwing up, try to get context, and then make changes. I think if you could get to this place where the software was running the decision making, and if there was behavioral aspects using small nudges of gamification, that's because I share the same opinion. I myself want this. The ability to understand where the flaws are is very hard, but if it can be presented to me because they have a truth file, I do think you can move the needle on both liquidity and optimization for people.
Yeah.
Yeah, but gosh, this feels really circular. We're going around and around, but I still worry about the fact that if people can't afford their lives, then all of these discussions that we're having, it's just not an option. And in a former life, I helped build a subprime credit card business that some people might know about, and spent a lot of time in focus groups, with customers one-on-one and talking to them in groups. And it's really interesting when you talk to, people who are living paycheck to paycheck about savings. And I remember being in one focus group in particular, sitting down with, this woman, and she was, kind of laughing at me when I was asking about savings. And I said, well, what does savings look like to you? And she said, look, I've overspent my paycheck every single week, every single month. I have more things that I need to buy for my kids than I can afford. So savings for me is buying the things that I need to buy every day, but having them cost less. That to me is savings. That is the only definition of savings that I have. So when you're dealing with, a whole slice of our society that is, acting, behaving, feeling that way because they're not making enough money, not making a living wage, then a lot of these other problems aren't even solvable. So, the redistribution of wealth, I think, is really important for a lot of reasons. And a lot of these problems aren't solvable, for huge portions of the population until we can get that, in the right place.
Yeah. All right. We have time for one more question. I'm going to let everybody weigh in on this one from Balaji. Is there a bull case for alternative investment startups? So investing in things like art or fractions of cars, sneakers, collectibles, stuff like that. So Jill, you go first, and then Frank and Will can close this off. Will?
Yeah, I was going to go there earlier. Actually, I think that this is one of the cooler trends that's emerged amongst younger millennials and Gen Z is the willingness to invest in just really, really out there alternative assets, sneakers, art, collectibles, digital collectibles, crypto kitties, you name it. Like, some of these are probably better investments than others, but I do think that there is something really interesting there from just a behavioral and diversification perspective that I think will be really important for anyone innovating in this kind of space to pay close attention to as a theme and a trend that I suspect will continue. And hey, if we do see sort of, emerging market style inflation creep up, sneakers might be the ultimate asset to own.
Right.
Yeah. I laugh about this because, everyone can make fun of me. I own personally 25,000 comic books. And, what's interesting about it is there might be 100 of them that are worth anything. So when you're investing in some of the alternative assets, you have to be really careful what you're doing.
Yeah.
You actually have to have a level of knowledge, that matches with where the accretion of value or the storage of value is going to be. But you can do well with art. You can do well with sneakers. You can do well with collectibles as long as you know what you're doing. You can imagine my collection was not meant for creating value. I've just been collecting since I was a kid. But if I had been doing it for investment, I would have had to strategically invest in the right places. So I would say it takes a level of skill to make that work, but it's a perfectly viable storage of value. I mean, it's outperformed inflation by a lot.
It's like my dad in baseball cards. Will, you collect baseball caps maybe?
You're just going to get a big shrug out of me. Democratized access to alternative assets being a form of alpha for the long tail has been like a concept for 35 years at this point. Massive Massive. It doesn't solve the core issue of what we were debating on the call, right? Because you're dealing in people who already have liquidity. I think there are massive selection biases. Like the reason alternatives outperform is because you can be on the right side of the selection bias trade in those markets, and I think it's hard to democratize that. So I think you'll always see them rolled out. I don't think they make a fundamental impact on people's long-term wealth creation in a long tail effect.
All right. Well, that was great, you guys. We need to do this more often. Next time we'll have a full chat on Robinhood and democratizing finance.
Let's do it. Would love that.
All right. Thank you, guys. I'll send you all the link once we have it up for people to replay it and stuff too. But this was perfect. I think we have people saying they loved it. So good job, guys. I learned something. So I'm sure other people did as well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good,
Have
everybody.
fun.